All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're going to be looking at Pakistan, exploring how literally thousands of years of history came together to create this incredibly complex, modern nation. It's a land that sits right on the frontiers of the world as we know it today, and, it's a place that constantly sparks deep emotions and really fierce debates.
Think about this quote for a second. It's a really powerful metaphor. The source material frames Pakistan as a nation born from this profound idealistic dream, a desired oasis of peace for millions of people. But almost immediately, it was confronted by some pretty grim, harsh realities. And it begs the question, what actually happens when a pure ideal is forced to operate as a tangible, functioning, everyday state?
To get a real handle on the Pakistan of today, we're going to follow a structured path in this explainer. We'll start with ancient roots to empire, move through colonialism and partition, the democratic struggle, economy and society, geopolitics and foreign relations, and finally wrap up with the road ahead.
Okay, Section 1, Ancient Roots to Empire, from the Indus Valley to the Mughals. Before we can even talk about modern borders, we absolutely have to look at the deep history here. The region's heritage is just unbelievably rich, starting way back in 2500 BCE with the Indus Valley Civilization. We're talking about cities like Mohenjo-Daro that had advanced urban planning thousands of years ago. Fast forward to the 7th century, the arrival of Islam brings profound cultural integration, which eventually paves the way for the magnificent 16th century Mughal Empire. Leaders like Akbar the Great stepped up and introduced lasting administrative innovations, kicking off a golden era of cultural prosperity.
Moving right along to Section 2, Colonialism and Partition, the Birth of a Nation.
So the absolute ideological bedrock for the creation of Pakistan, the thing you really need to understand, is the two-nation theory. It was articulated by visionary figures like Allama Iqbal and formally adopted in the 1940 Lahore Resolution. Basically, it argued that because there were such stark, fundamental differences in social customs, literature, and religious philosophies, Muslims needed a completely separate homeland to govern their own affairs.
And if you look at the politics right before 1947, you had this really stark contrast. The source notes that on one side, the Indian National Congress was pushing hard for a united, secular India once the British left. But on the flip side, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the All India Muslim League were out there successfully mobilizing the masses specifically for self-determination to make that two-nation theory a reality.
15 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That staggering number represents the massive, forced, and violent migration across the newly drawn borders in 1947. It was an incredibly chaotic transition. Roughly 1 million people tragically perished, and it left deep, deep psychological scars on the entire region.
So, that beautiful, idealistic dream we mentioned earlier? It hit a brick wall of reality pretty much on day one. Born on August 14th, 1947, this newly formed state had to miraculously build democratic institutions essentially from scratch. They were dealing with a skeletal administrative setup, a severe lack of state functionaries. They lost major industrial infrastructure to India. And on top of it all, they had this bizarre geographical split separating East and West Pakistan by hundreds of miles of hostile territory.
Which brings us to Section 3, the democratic struggle, a political pendulum.
If you look at the leadership history here, it's literally a pendulum. It just keeps swinging back and forth. You have this constant tug-of-war for the nation's identity between military administrations who kept entrenching themselves using martial law and civilian governments led by rival parties like the PPP and PMLN. And those civilian eras, they were usually marked by turbulent politics and sudden, sweeping dismissals.
This whole political jigsaw puzzle evolved dramatically over the decades. You had Ayub Khan declaring the first martial law in '58, right through to the traumatic secession of East Pakistan in 1971. A really crucial turning point was when the military, particularly under General Zia-ul-Haq in 1977, aligned with religious factions to initiate sweeping Islamization policies. That created a deep religious-secular divide that is still totally central to Pakistani civil society today, even after they historically returned to civilian elections in 2008.
Okay, Section 4, Economy and Society, the data-driven realities.
Let's talk about the people for a second. Look at this demographic reality. 63% of the population is under 25 years old. That is a massive youth bulge. Now, on one hand, that represents immense, incredible potential. But on the other hand, it demands urgent structural support right now. Otherwise, they risk widespread unemployment, frustration, and serious social unrest.
And where do most of these folks work? Well, despite all the modernization efforts over the years, agriculture is still the absolute backbone of the economy. It employs about 65% of the workforce. But the text points out that a severe lack of meaningful policy in this sector has unfortunately led to technological stagnation and persistent rural poverty.
But here's the really concerning part. How is the country funding the future for all those young people? Well, neighbor India spends about 4.5% of its GDP on education, but Pakistan? It's sitting at just 1.7%. When you compare them regionally, this stark underinvestment is a glaring, critical vulnerability for the nation's long-term development.
To put an even finer point on this education crisis, 39%. That is the chunk of kids aged 5 to 9 who are just completely out of school. It's a profound challenge, and it's heavily compounded by a serious lack of professional teaching competence and overall accountability.
But, society isn't just taking this lying down. Elite and working-class women, alongside youth groups, have historically organized for their rights and empowerment. However, the source explains that their efforts almost constantly collide with systemic resistance, conservative legislation, and those deeply entrenched interpretations of cultural norms we discussed earlier.
Section 5. Geopolitics and Foreign Relations. A Strategic Crossroads.
Zooming out for a second, Pakistan's spot on the global map is uniquely challenging. Their foreign policy has almost always been defined by their neighborhood. They were historically a proxy middle ground between the US and the USSR, and they've fought 3 major wars with India over the fiercely contested Kashmir region. Later, they joined the US-led war on terror, which brought in massive military and economic aid. And today, they're actively deepening ties with China. Throughout all of this, the text objectively notes that Pakistan has often prioritized deterrence against India and military alliances over independent economic development. And finally, Section 6, the road ahead, future prospects and challenges. So what's next? The structural issues facing the nation today are, frankly, huge. We're talking extreme vulnerability to climate change, like massive flooding and melting glaciers. Their economy relies way too heavily on consumption-based growth, creating big inflation risks. And they're still struggling to manage that complex intersection of state, religion, and extremism. These are deep structural realities, right? You literally cannot solve them just by shifting political parties in and out of power.
Which really just leaves us with one massive final question. Ultimately, the future of Pakistan depends entirely on what the nation makes of its present. It's a country of immense complexity, incredible resilience, and vast, vast potential. It leaves us to wonder, how will this ancient cradle of civilization, armed with this huge, energetic youth population, manage to write its next chapter? And perhaps, finally turn that horizon of despair back into a realized dream?